All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Andrea Perdomo Morales, and I am the Chief Program Officer at Vibrant Health. And on behalf of the Reach Healthcare Foundation, Vibrant Health and Communities Concerned for Immigrants and Refugees, or otherwise known as CCIR, we want to welcome each of you and thank you for being here with us this morning virtually. Today, we are very excited to host our ongoing forums, and we are able to have a wonderful individual with us from the National Immigration Law Center. We are excited to be able to introduce Ben Davanzo. He is the Senior Health Policy Analyst, and Ben Davanzo works on access to healthcare and healthy lives for low-income immigrant communities. Through advocacy, relationship building, and analysis, he advances policies that enhance the health of immigrant families and works to block those that bring harm with a focus on federal legislation and executive action. So Ben, thank you so much for being here with us this morning, and we will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you all for having me. I apologize if there's any background noise, as we all kind of balance working from home. As the introduction said, my name is Ben Davanzo. I am the Senior Health Policy Analyst at the National Immigration Law Center. We're the nation's foremost advocacy organization and litigating organization focused on the needs of low-income immigrants, and particularly we are one of the few organizations that works at a national level and advocating for the needs of the health and well-being, including access to healthcare of immigrant populations. And so that is kind of the context we're going with. I'm going to focus my presentation on both just reminding folks about what barriers immigrants face. For some of you, this might be something you're very familiar with if you work with immigrant populations on a day-to-day basis, and that work is just so important, and I thank you for it. And then kind of going through what we are looking to the White House to do in this new political environment, as well as what we are looking for the Congress to do in this new political environment. So I'll kind of be running through, and by the end of this presentation, you should have a sense of both what's possible to happen in Congress at the federal level and the White House over the next year or so, and what maybe you can do to help move that forward, and where we might be seeing some challenges as well. So let's see. So yeah, as a reminder, immigrants are blocked from many public healthcare programs. So unlike US citizens who are, if they're income eligible for programs like the Affordable Care Act, tax credits, or Medicaid, immigrants may not be eligible for those. If they are undocumented immigrants, they're ineligible for basically most health insurance programs, with the exception of some states. There are immigrants who are lawfully present, and if you're a lawfully present immigrant, for the most part, you can get Affordable Care Act insurance. But unless you are deemed qualified, or unless you have had a green card or other certain qualified statuses for more than 5 years, you're ineligible for Medicaid, the program for low-income people, and for the Children's Health Insurance Program, which is for low and lower middle-income kids. So in most states, there actually is an exception to that. States have the option of covering kids who may not be qualified, but are lawfully present, as well as pregnant women under CHIP and Medicaid. Kansas has not actually taken that option. So I'll just highlight, I don't work on state policy issues, but that is one thing that Kansas could actually do, and that many states have done, you know, from Texas. Florida is one of the most recent ones, to get all kids who are lawfully present covered under the Children's Health Insurance and Medicaid programs. And what this leads to, these restrictions, leads to at a national level, and I don't believe that we currently have state level data, although we're working on it, that compared to US citizens, immigrants are disproportionately uninsured. Almost a quarter of people who are lawfully present are uninsured, and almost half of undocumented immigrants are uninsured. And so what this means from NILC's point of view and why we really focus on breaking down those barriers that I mentioned is if you don't have health insurance, that means that getting healthcare is very, very hard. There are exceptions. Undocumented immigrants can get emergency care covered. That's a very, very limited spectrum. The way I'm talking about it now is a very, very simplified way of talking about who has access to what. There's many immigration statuses and many different healthcare programs, but the kind of overall trends we see are really that because there are so many barriers, in addition to eligibility, but also language, also information, also community outreach, also just the complexity of applying for the programs, particularly if you work in jobs that may be paying in cash or if you have complicated family situations with a mixed status family. These are all barriers and lead to immigrants being very uninsured, which particularly during a pandemic is a very bad thing. Another big barrier to immigrants has been the public charge rule. I know there's a presentation to this group about this a while ago from my colleague Gabrielle, who also works on health at the National Immigration Law Center. Just as a brief reminder, the public charge rule is a rule that was created under the Trump administration, and it focuses on people who are either applying for green cards or visas. It does not apply to people who are applying for citizenship or who already have their green card. But what the rule said is that, prior, very few people were subject to this rule because it focused on a very narrow set of cash assistance and long-term care programs. The Trump administration, and we're about a year to the anniversary of when the rule took effect, determined that Medicaid, SNAP, and housing programs could be used to deny someone a green card or a visa, either if they have used those programs or if they are likely to use it. This was part of the overall totality of circumstances test that is used to evaluate whether someone may be a public charge that takes into account a variety of factors to determine whether they are likely to receive a public benefit in the future. So we have seen really harmful effects from the public charge rule. We've seen hundreds of thousands of children disenrolled from programs. Research has said 1 in 7 immigrant adults or have said their families have avoided public assistance programs because of concerns about it or their family's immigration status. And it could be much more. Survey data is pretty limited in what it can determine, especially about immigrants. But we really have worried, and we continue to hear every day new reports of people who have, for example, don't want to get COVID testing or don't want to get the vaccine because of the public charge rule. And I would say now very clearly that if you are working with immigrants or people with those concerns, the Department of Homeland Security has stated explicitly that COVID-related care will not count, and we're actually pushing them to make that more clear and distributing that information to families. But because 1 in 4 kids has an immigrant parent, we are very worried about the chilling effect of the public charge rule. Just as a reminder, right, this rule does not affect most people who are eligible for public assistance programs because of those existing barriers that I discussed. You very much likely have to either have a green card or are exempt from public charge in order to be impacted. But we know that immigrant families have trouble navigating, and there's a lot of rumors. And that as a result, many, many people are afraid of using public assistance programs or even healthcare in the first place. So now to kind of move to the context of where 2020, the elections have changed the conversation and what we're looking towards. There were discussions around immigrant access to healthcare in especially the Democratic primary, where actually almost all of the Democratic candidates during one debate said that they would give access to healthcare to undocumented immigrants to the general election. The Biden-Sanders Unity Plan explicitly said that removing that 5-year waiting period was something that they wanted to address, as well as address the fact that DACA recipients are currently blocked from accessing healthcare. And then, of course, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And given that around 1 in 10 African Americans, 1 in 3 Latinos, 2 in 3 Asian Americans, a quarter of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are foreign born, it's impossible to address racial disparities without addressing disparities for immigrants. And so these are all things that were raised in the debates and the discussions around the election, and that we know that the Biden administration will have to be held accountable to, considering so much of the election pivoted on those issues. So focusing now on the White House. As a reminder, right, just a little Civics 101 for those of you who don't live and think politics day to day like I do. We have a system of government where Congress passes laws and basically tells government agencies what to do, but then the government agencies led by the White House and the president have a lot of, although not infinite, discretion about how to implement programs, make priorities, spend money, and that sort of thing. They issue many regulations. Regulations are the rules for how programs work. And so we are both focused on what the White House can do without Congress, considering the political situation. I will touch on a little bit later when I turn to Congress, as well as, the fact that the Trump administration really wielded the power of the White House like a horrible hammer. And so there's a lot of work to undo the harm of what Trump did and, in fact, go in the opposite direction. So what we are prioritizing is first undoing the harm. So ending the Trump administration's hateful policies, and particularly the public charge test that I mentioned. As we know, and we are highlighting for the administration, and we see new media stories every day, and I would be fascinated to hear if, share in the Q&A if you all are hearing such stories, but immigrants are avoiding healthcare. And we also are really concerned about adjacent policies. There's a proclamation that Trump issued that basically said that you couldn't come to the country if you couldn't buy unsubsidized private insurance. No-led litigation that put a block to that, so it was never implemented, and it is still I'll get to what happened to it in a second, but it's been blocked, as well as concerns around sponsors being held liable for use of public benefits by the immigrant family members or employees or what have you that they are sponsoring. So the Biden administration has actually issued a number of executive actions already. There has been, actually, this is a little outdated, well over 17 at this point. There was just a new one yesterday, rolling back the Biden administration's, or the Trump administration's rather, restrictions on immigration for that was justified by the pandemic. But there was within the first week, I forget exactly what it was, maybe his 7th, 8th, 9th day in office, something like that. He issued a executive order that explicitly addressed public charge and directed the secretaries of the agencies in charge of the public charge regulations to review it. It also explicitly withdrew that healthcare proclamation. And so we are really happy to see very quickly the Biden administration coming through on some of its commitments. Now, to be very, very clear, the public charge rule is still in effect. Because it is a regulation, there is a process in order to undo it. This process has actually helped to protect immigrants because between the time that the public charge rule was first proposed and when it came into law, thanks to those regulatory processes, was about 3 years. And so we hope and expect that it will not take nearly that long to undo it, but it may take several months for the Department of Homeland Security to actually do the review and the necessary regulatory process to end the public charge rule. However, we do expect within coming days and months some information coming out from the administration more explicitly about the future of public charge. In the meantime, we really want to make sure that families understand how public charge rule affects them. Right now, as I mentioned, that most families' use of public benefits does not impact their immigration status. Very few families are eligible for programs that would be impacted by public charge. And so we are really encouraging families to sign up for programs like Medicaid or SNAP that impact their health. We also, like I said, really want to make sure that families know that testing, treatment, and vaccines are explicitly not going to be used in a public charge determination in the time between now and when we hope the rule is reversed. And so sending that message to immigrant families is something that we and our partners in the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which is a campaign that we co-founded and now has over 500 organizations, are working to disseminate around public charge. We're also working to go beyond addressing just what the Trump administration did in terms of harm. So addressing language access, for example, is important. We continue to hear from communities that people's ability to speak English is a major source of problems when it comes to going to a doctor or enrolling in public assistance programs or finding out about the existence of public assistance programs. So language access is an important thing that the administration can do to ensure that people's civil rights are protected. The Trump administration also did a number of harmful things to while they couldn't repeal the Affordable Care Act, they undermined it, like allowing the proliferation of really bad plans that really don't cover many services, as well as websites that kind of send confusing messages to consumers. And then really helping the providers like federally qualified health centers that serve many, many immigrants and ensuring that they really get the funding and resources that they need to adequately serve populations that they serve. Then we really think that at the core of addressing immigrant health is community-based organizations, like many federally qualified health centers are. Those organizations that have the trust and are embedded in communities. So, for example, we're funding and expanding the Navigator program. This is the program that funds organizations to help people enroll in Affordable Care Act insurance, as well as direct specific COVID-19 funding. There's a lot of money being made available to the CDC to address the pandemic, and so ensuring that immigrant organizations have access to that money is something that we think they should do. And we really think that they're considering that there's so many different federal agencies that address programs that impact immigrant health and well-being, from the agencies that do immigrant enforcement to the agencies that give immigrants potentially access to health and nutrition and housing. There's really a lack of coordination, and we're encouraging the Biden administration to do better on that. Moving to the new Congress. So as many of you know, probably, the outcome of the election was that Democrats very, very narrowly control both the House and the Senate. Legislation needs to pass both of those chambers in order to move. They actually have a narrower majority in the House. I think it's about 6 members right now. So if 6 Democrats change their vote against a piece of legislation, then that can actually sink it. The Senate is split 50-50, but because the vice president breaks ties, Democrats can control the process. That being said, most legislation takes 60 votes to pass the Senate. And so for the most part, Democrats actually have to work with Republicans if they want anything to pass. There are some procedures that I find very interesting, but I imagine most folks don't want me to go into the weeds about. But there are some ways to pass some narrow pieces of legislation. And by narrow, I mean it has to be focused on changing spending. So that is how the $1.9 trillion plan that is moving through Congress now is going to be passed, but it can only actually be used 2 or 3 times throughout the next Congress. And so there's a very narrow window for when that can be used. So I don't expect there will be legislating, but I'm not expecting a lot of legislating over the next couple of years because of even if Democrats control Congress, there's just a number of things that make their jobs very hard. We do have asks for Congress, though. We want them to fix the immigration system, right? We know that both the large, 11 million undocumented folks who are very much right now serving on the front lines of the pandemic and essential services, they need access to status, and we need to make sure that people who have been waiting for decades for green cards to be reunited with their families need to have a pathway to the U.S. We want to see bold healthcare ideas, addressing those barriers, and I'm going to get to how explicitly to immigrants. But really, if we address healthcare more broadly, that make healthcare more affordable, that really helps immigrants who are disproportionately low income. And so that's something we definitely support. And then making sure that the COVID-19 pandemic response actually reaches immigrant communities. So there has been a proposal to address the immigration system, right? The U.S. Citizenship Act was unveiled as a framework by President Biden, I think on his first or second day in office. And then it was just introduced last Friday in Congress as a bill. It does a lot of really important things, creating a status, access to status and eventually citizenship for most people who are currently undocumented. Not all people who have had interactions with the criminal justice system may face some barriers, and I'm not an expert in that, but I know my colleagues have expressed some concerns. But there will be a path to citizenship. That being said, while people are on this path to citizenship, especially within a 5-year temporary status, they will have access to no healthcare programs, much like the case is now, and we actually find that very disappointing. The bill explicitly has to rule out that they're eligible for the Affordable Care Act. They did nothing and just gave people the status they would have access to Affordable Care Act benefits. So that is concerning. It is unclear if this bill has a path to become law. Like I said, this is one of those things that would need 60 votes in the Senate, but there may be smaller, more narrow versions of access to pathways for immigrants. And so we will be watching very closely both if this bill moves, as well as others, to ensure and advocate, and will need help to ensure that legislation giving access to status for immigrants does not create new barriers, and in fact should undo old barriers to access to health. So there is legislation that does undo most of those barriers. So the Heal for Immigrant Women and Families Act, which has been introduced in Congress and was last year by Representative Pramila Jayapal and Senator Cory Booker, undoes many of the existing barriers. It gets rid of that 5-year waiting period. It makes it so if you're lawfully present, including if DACA recipients, for example, you can get access to Medicaid and CHIP and the Affordable Care Act. And it actually does allow undocumented folks to get subsidized ACA care. We feel that these folks are paying taxes and therefore they should be able to get healthcare tax credits. And so this is the big main bill that we look to when we say, you know, what should our healthcare system look like for immigrants? We talk about the HEAL Act, and we really push Congress to address it. Oh, I'm not sure. Sorry, my PowerPoint, I think, got a little messed up. Okay. And I think I accidentally put the question thing to the end. I'll go back to that. Sorry about that. So additional bills I want to flag in terms of policies that we really would like to see Congress change. There is a bill by Representative Barbara Lee and Senator Elizabeth Warren that would specifically fund community-based organizations to do outreach and provide services around the pandemic, like contact tracing, connecting people to vaccines, helping people understand what their risks are in terms of contracting COVID. Right now, there's no dedicated funding for community organizations, and this bill explicitly takes a racial equity focus, and we think that's really great. There's also legislation to require federal agencies to translate COVID-19 documents. Right now, if you go to the CDC website and go to their COVID-19 page, you'll see that page is only available in 4 languages. And that is pretty unacceptable considering we're now a year into the pandemic and considering that there's over 20 million people who are limited English proficient in the US. Many of them do speak languages that are represented in many of the materials like Spanish and Vietnamese and Korean. But many people, especially speaking smaller populations, whether it's Pacific Islanders from the Marshall Islands or people from African countries like Ethiopia, especially in the DC area near me, people who speak languages from big refugee populations are not getting language access materials. And we think that the government needs to do a lot better on that, as well as needs to really make sure that when people go to the doctor, they have access to an interpreter, both during the pandemic, but also really going forward. And that's something we hear continues to be an issue. There's additional legislation from Representative Underwood and Senator Tina Smith, that additionally funds providers and other community organizations around the pandemic. And then I wanted to highlight the Enroll Act, because I mentioned Navigators back at a few minutes ago. Again, Navigators are the program funded by the federal government to help people enroll in affordable care coverage. And so the Enroll Act would create a permanent source of funding for Navigators and make improvements to that program. I'll note that federally qualified health centers are getting funding to enroll people, and we think that's really important outside of the Navigator program, and we think they should get more of it. And then just to highlight, there is one bill that was introduced last Congress, and we hope will be introduced again, the Coronavirus Immigrant Families Protection Act, that does a number of the things that I've been talking about around funding community organizations, around funding language access. It addresses public charge. It provides, there is the emergency Medicaid program, I alluded to that allows undocumented people to get emergency services. We think that states should be explicitly allowed to cover COVID testing, treatment, and actually vaccinations under that program. And so this is one bill that is really the core target to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic from an immigrant point of view. And so Representative Chu, Judy Chu from California, and Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii have led that bill, and we really support it. So that's my presentation. I will go back to the questions slide that I put at the end, although I know that we'll take questions more at the end of the program after we have the next speaker, but happy to answer questions by email if you want as well. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that helpful information. I appreciate that you're giving us an overview and kind of an update on what's to come, and how we definitely have a lot of work to do to undo some of the chilling effects that we're still seeing here. I know as a federally qualified health center employee, we still to this day are seeing patients that are worried about the public charge, and that has a trickle down effect. And we want to make sure that families are healthy and feel like they can access healthcare without worrying. So hopefully we'll see some more information coming on that, but appreciate your time. So next we have with us Catalina Velarde, and Catalina is with us here this morning talking from the perspective. She has two hats on. She is the commissioner from the Kansas Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, and also she is an advisor for the Kansas Hispanic and Latino American Affairs Commission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catalina, and she will share with us a little bit about what's going on here locally. Catalina, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea. My presentation is going to be quite a shift from Ben's. What I'd like to talk about is the efforts that are going on here in Kansas. And like Andrea said, I am one of the commissioners in the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. The Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice was formed this past summer of 2020 after the racial unrest that we saw in the spring and summer. And it is composed of over a dozen members, commissioners throughout the state, out of different industries and areas of expertise. And we are our mandate is to analyze what's going on in Kansas and to provide recommendations that create a more welcoming, inclusive, and equitable environment in Kansas throughout the scope of all of government in Kansas. So we're looking at executive agency actions. We're looking at legislative actions. We're looking at actions that can be enacted at the local level. And similarly to that, my other hat as an advisor to the Kansas Hispanic and Latino American Affairs Commission, same thing. The Latino and American Affairs Commission released their policy agenda for 2021, which deals with a lot of these same issues. So I'll be sending a link to the through the chat to the commission's report, but I'd like to show you a little bit of what the recommendations were. So the commission's mandate, it goes for 2 years. So we're still doing work as throughout the commission. But our first report that was released to the governor at the end of last year dealt primarily with issues in law enforcement. So it's quite an in-depth look as to all sorts of issues regarding, officer recruitment, training, community policing, disciplining and complaints process. And of course, there was a section as to policing in our immigrant communities. So, I won't make you read the recommendations, but one of the goals that we have is we certainly want to make sure that our policing bodies are more representative of our communities. So one of the actions that we recommended, and one of the bills that we're currently working to get introduced, is a recommendation to change the Kansas statute. The Kansas statute, I don't know for how many people are aware of this, but by law in the state of Kansas, a person has to be a U.S. citizen in order to be a police officer. So we want to change this to make it more equitable and open the door to persons of other lawful immigration statuses, not just permanent residents, but also persons with DACA, TPS, U visa, these other very long-ranging immigration statuses that are perfectly vetted and valid and granted by USCIS and the Department of Homeland Security. But for people who might not necessarily have yet a pathway to permanent residency. So that would be in line with programs that are implemented by the military, like the MABNY program. So we're hoping to gain traction with that piece of legislation. Another one of the recommendations that we have in the commission that I think is also going to hopefully do well as far as introduction into the legislature is the recommendation that police sign certifications for persons who are victims of violent crime. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this process called the U visa process, there is a method well, this law came about, actually. I'll give you the history. So back in the year 2000, law enforcement agencies and prosecuting bodies were coming to the realization that when undocumented immigrants are the victims of violent crime, they're very often resistant to the idea of approaching police to even report their offense, to assist in the investigation and the prosecution of the offense. They don't want to press charges. They don't want to testify. They don't want to identify the suspect, because they feel that because the undocumented immigrant victim feels that just by the mere act of approaching the police, they risk themselves being put into the deportation process. So this legislation came about to build that community trust, to help encourage the community to go ahead and reach out to policing agencies, to go ahead and provide information regarding the offenses, so that the police could actually better do their work in catching the persons responsible for these offenses. So when this passed back in 2000, this was a near unanimous bipartisan effort to make this happen. So in order for a person who's a victim of a violent crime to apply for this status, you have to have been the victim of the offense. First of all, you have to be have suffered harm, and you have to be of assistance to the law enforcement or prosecution. The law does not require that at any point somebody be arrested, prosecuted, or convicted for the offense. All it requires is that you as the victim were willing to collaborate to whatever extent you were able to. But as part of the application process, this is visa that you solicit with USCIS, as part of the application process, the victim has to obtain a signed certification form, which is signed by the law enforcement agency or by the prosecutor. And the form, all it does is just verifies that, yes, Catalina was the victim of a crime. Yes, she, provided information regarding the offense. The investigation is open, closed, ongoing, what have you. That's it. That's the extent of the requirement that is requested from the law enforcement agencies. But what we've run across in Kansas, and in particular with our greater Kansas City metropolitan area, is that oftentimes law enforcement agencies are unfamiliar with the process, and they feel that perhaps signing off on these forms is, immediately awarding, lawful immigration status. They just misunderstand what the intent of the certification form is, and they oftentimes decline to sign these certification forms that again, the victims who were harmed and have approached police to assist, then the victim doesn't receive the assistance to which they are entitled to apply with the status for USCIS. So we're hoping to get a bill through the Kansas legislature that compels law enforcement agencies to sign these certification forms when they are approached by victims who meet the requirements for the U visa. So I think this would again be very helpful to victims, be very helpful in building community trust, and we're hoping that legislation goes far. There are there have been in the past attempts to get driver's license initiatives for non-citizens. Right now, I don't know that that's a realistic possibility, but I think there is opportunity for advocacy for groups to work with their communities because everybody wants, do we want more licensed drivers or fewer? Do we want more insured drivers on the road or not? So I think there's still an increased opportunity for advocacy as far as that is concerned. So those are the initiatives that are going on at the state level. Locally in the Kansas City metropolitan area, there are a couple of initiatives in Roland Park and in Wyandotte County as far as creating safe and welcoming policies. Now, safe and welcoming is an attempt to create city ordinances and police policies that are welcoming to immigrant communities, that instruct law enforcement that it's not necessary to inquire into the immigration status of somebody that you stop, that there's should not be a need to affirmatively contact immigration authorities, or also to instruct folks as to the principle that ICE detainers are not mandatory. Receiving an ICE, when a law enforcement agency receives a detainer request from ICE, this is not a compelling something that's mandatory, obligatory for the law enforcement agency to do. It is completely at the discretion and determination of the law enforcement agency. And if it turns out that ICE has erroneously issued a detainer and the law enforcement agency has incorrectly detained somebody who turns out to have lawful status and be a U.S. citizen, then who's left holding the bill for having essentially falsely imprisoned somebody is the local law enforcement agency. So those are efforts going on in Roland Park and in Wyandotte. Those are still underway right now. So we've yet to see the fruits of this, but those are the kind of advocacy efforts that are going on locally. We'll also send through the KHLAC legislative agenda, which includes a lot of the same points as the governor's report. So driver's license, expanding the opportunity for non-citizens to be law enforcement officers, and of course continuing to protect in-state tuition for undocumented students, and then of course increasing language access and protecting refugee resettlement efforts. So that is it from me, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Perfect. Thank you, Catalina. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate those overviews. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. Catalina, I went ahead and put in both of those links in the chat. So hopefully, if you are in need of those, please feel free to reference them in the chat. We do have a couple of questions that are coming in. So let me just get to those real quick. Let's see here. The first question, and this is for either of you. What Spanish language websites or sources can you recommend for Spanish speakers to follow these federal and Kansas policies and recommendations? So I don't know, Ben or Catalina, if you want to.
I think just making sure that folks follow pages like the like the CCIR page, or like the Cage, like a social media page, and other organizations that serve the Latino community. I think those are the best ways. For example, I know Cage Black does a weekly radio show that they also share with Facebook Live. So it's just as easy as making sure that you're following trustworthy sources of information rather than the misinformation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
On COVID, I'll say, like, there actually is a good amount of Spanish language resources out there. Both CDC has translated its COVID-19 website. If you go there in Spanish, it has a whole multilingual webpage, or multilingual resource page that has a lot of Spanish resources. Like I said, it doesn't have as many as we would like in other languages, although most languages are covered in some way. And then there are organizations like Telemundo and Unidos US that have also developed resources and are trusted sources of information as well.
Perfect. Thank you both for that. The next question is, does the U visa process for certification not exist in Kansas at all? How will the legislation compel law enforcement to sign those certifications?
So I can take that one. So yes, I mean, there are law enforcement agencies and prosecuting agencies throughout the state of Kansas that are familiar with the U visa process, that do sign off on certification forms. So this legislation is meant to inform primarily areas that are more unfamiliar with the process, or that, again, for perhaps racial bias reasons, often decline to sign these certification forms. For example, there was an issue here in Kansas City, Kansas, where for a while law enforcement was declining to sign certifications if the crime was deemed not solvable, which to me is victim blaming, because again, it's not on the victim to solve the crime. And right now everybody's wearing winter hats and masks on their face. If something terrible happened to me, but I'm not able to, I can give information to law enforcement regarding what happened to me, but perhaps not sufficient identifying information as to my assailant, that crime might be deemed not solvable, and I, as the victim, might not get a signed certification form. But that does not negate what happened to me as the victim. So we want to enact this bill so that, again, all that the certification form is requiring from law enforcement is that they verify, crime happened, this was the crime, these were the injuries, this was the information the victim provided, done. So there's no other analysis there's no real analysis that's being required of the law enforcement agencies, but yet still they often decline to sign these certification forms just based on a lack of understanding. And we're trying to, make the U visa, make the certification option more accessible to victims.
Sounds like more increased awareness is definitely needed as well. All right, the next question is, I heard from a parent My family is leaving to Mexico, but I'm staying because Biden promised a reform. I want to be hopeful, but I also want to share practical resources with parents. What could be the best response to comments like these?
I think,
So,
Karen was saying it, like, we don't know, like, nothing is a passed law until it's a passed law. So, I appreciate the enthusiasm. I certainly understand it. But I think it's very important um, to get people focused on listening to trustworthy resources. A lot of people, fall prey to, in these situations when we're hearing buzz of a potential something exciting, new happening. That's where people fall prey to things like notario fraud, because, for example, I'm from Mexico. When I hear the word notario, in Mexico, a notario is somebody who's an attorney and who is not just any attorney. It's usually an attorney with experience, because notarioships are granted by the state governor. So, but here a notary is something completely different. So people fall. Unfortunately, a lot of our community falls prey to this misinformation and get taken advantage of, and then they go to unscrupulous persons who file paperwork that, for a benefit that somebody's not eligible to receive yet. And all that does is get somebody flagged and tossed into deportation proceedings. So it's very problematic.
Thank you, Catalina. Ben, do you have something to add?
yeah, I would not make decisions, as Catalina was saying, on anything that is not yet law, not even like anything that is not yet implemented. So there's rumors, there's information, people say things happen, especially over social media, but even news websites get a lot of details wrong, or the fact that Biden has said he might do something. Until something is law and until it's implemented. And I think the best way of determining that would be in conversation with someone's immigration lawyer and attorneys. Decision making on what might happen or what could happen could lead to not super helpful results. And so I would not encourage people to make decisions based on rumors and what might happen.
Perfect, thank you. The next question I think is for Ben. It says, would you please repeat who public charge pertains to currently and who needs to still practice caution at this time?
Yep, I'll say I would really recommend going to protectingimmigrantfamilies.org. That website has resources that spell all of this out, including community-focused messaging and information about the latest, and that we will continue to keep updated. So protectingimmigrantfamilies.org. So in terms of just public charge law, public charge applies to people who are applying to entry into the U.S., to adjustment of status, or for a green card. So people who are applying for a visa or a green card. People who have a green card now or who have U.S. citizenship are not impacted by public charge, nor do the decisions of family members impact. So if you have someone who's trying to get a green card and you are talking to someone who has U.S. citizenship, who either lives or is considering sponsoring that person, their decisions do not impact a public charge determination. Public charge is a totality of circumstances test, so there is no black or white. So first, the people who are eligible for public assistance programs are almost generally ineligible or are not going to be facing a public charge test. So if you are eligible for Medicaid, for example, the odds are pretty low that you're going to intersect with a public charge system just because of how the exemptions in public charge work, as well as the eligibility rules. In addition, public charge decisions are made on not just whether you have used healthcare programs, but also a broader look at someone's skills, income, education, family circumstances, things like that, that are reviewed by the immigration officer. And so just because someone has used or might use public assistance program is not the only factor that is used in a public charge determination. And so while we do encourage people to make individual decisions in conversations with their immigration attorneys, we do provide information on that website that encourages people to use the programs that allow them to stay healthy and therefore keep their jobs, or allow their kids to stay healthy and stay in school and get an education. We think that's really important. And to clarify again, very specifically, the Department of Homeland Security has said, and you can look at the public charge website for Homeland Security, and it says this, that COVID-related treatment and testing and vaccines are not used in a public charge determination. And in fact, DHS has also said it will not be doing immigration enforcement around COVID vaccine locations.
Perfect. Well, that's reassuring. Thank you, Ben, to let us know that DHS has been explicit in saying that. So with that, we have come to our time this morning. I want to give a big virtual round of applause to Ben and Catalina. Thank you both very much for taking your time and being with us here this morning to share all of these updates and things that we need to keep in mind and how we can best advocate for the families that we're working with. With that, everybody who attended today, we would love to be able to send out a survey. CCIR, or Communities Concerned for Immigrants and Refugees, is undergoing a strategic planning process right now. And part of that is hearing feedback from those of you that are attending our forums and want to see more forums like this. We would want to incorporate your thought processes and ideas into our working plan moving forward. So you'll be receiving that survey here in the next couple of days, and we would just love to hear back from you. We do plan on having some additional forums in March, so stay tuned for those. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.